I'm going to turn now to China's relations with its three key Asian partners, India, Japan, and Southeast Asia. And I wonder if you could sort of very briefly, let's start with India and talk about, how is it that these two countries have in general lived at peace with each other for most of the past 2000 years? Indeed, the scholars collaborated, as you know, in Nalanda University, a project that you were involved with. So, what does the history of China-India relations tell us about the future, you think?
I think what it tells us is that when the relationship was never based on political power or the search for power
Mm,
or dominance of any kind, but really based on trade, when there was trade, and on interchange of ideas. And in this case, it was a change of ideas coming from India to China.
mm,
Very few ideas came from China to India, as far as I know, but the Buddhism and a whole related set of ideals which are at the heart of what is the Hindu spiritual tradition, when they were brought to China, the China was so taken by it that they actually looked upon India as a Western heaven.
mm,
That's a Tianxia by itself, it's a heaven by itself.
mm,
And all the devoted Buddhists in China, and we are talking about probably the large proportion of the Chinese people were Buddhists in one way or the other. In their Buddhist context, they will always recognize India as the Western heaven. And that's where wisdom came from. And Buddhism manifested itself in China, and the Chinese accepted that. They reinterpreted it in some ways, but in a way we made them more comfortable, but they accepted it almost wholly. And so India was always a kind of mystical, wonderful place for a long time. But there were no other political relationships with India, because India has other concerns. India's concerns were mainly with the West.
That's
Their
right.
problems with really was Afghanistan and
Mughals.
and Persia
Yes.
and Central Asia, the Turco-Mongol,
Yes.
the
Yes.
Moguls and so on. So they nothing to do with China, and whatever there was to do with China was trade by sea. The Indians came to sea to southern coast of China, and Chinese went to India for trade in South India particularly, and that was peaceful, always peaceful. So no political relationship. They were fine for 2,000 years. Where did the political relationship come from? It came from the East India Company in Bengal wanting to trade with Tibet. I mean, when people like Hastings, and after that, all the way for a whole century until the young husband actually they sent an army to Lhasa. And that, all that bayonets to Lhasa is a famous book on that. So this was a different relationship where the British were thinking about how imperial India could somehow have a special relationship with Tibet. And in particular, they were fearful of the Russians reaching Tibet, coming in from Turkestan. And the Russians had an advantage because it was much easier to get from Turkestan to Tibet because there were no Himalayas, whereas the Himalayas was a major obstacle.
Yes.
So they didn't want the Russians to have that advantage. And one of the most interesting results was the British found it in their interest to recognize Qing sovereignty. They use the word suzerainty, but they now agree that there's no real difference between suzerainty and sovereignty. They recognize Qing suzerainty over Tibet in order to keep the Russians out, because by so doing, then the Russians must deal with the Qing on any matters pertaining to Tibet. And that protected Tibet from the Russians. And so the British actually supported China, Qing China, where Tibet was concerned, by using this vague word suzerainty, which nobody was very clear about at the time. But in the meantime, of course, there were others who believed that Tibetans should have had an independent existence. So there were shades of disagreement about what that meant. But what they left behind was really a question of drawing the borders between British India and Qing China. And then you have the famous the debates that ended up with the McMahon line and all that. The details are very complicated, but the net result was finally India and China had a political border problem, which they never had before. And that's the source of all the problems thereafter.
That's true. And as we know, that border problem has become quite serious. But I hope that India and China will bear in mind their longer history.
But this is actually the only real issue
That's
between
right.
India and China.